girls. My name is Nikki, Tigg. I'm so glad to spend a few minutes with you guys today. I hope you're enjoying the study so far. Today we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And I encourage you to read the whole chapter. We're only going to be able to cover like the first 13 verses today, so I encourage you to read the whole thing. So we have a message from Paul that we're going to look at. And he's using the Israelites as an example and just really a warning to us and just to help us in our everyday life. So the chapter starts off by talking about the blessings that the Israelites had. So verse 1 tells us that they were under the cloud and they passed through the sea. So they experienced the blessing of being led in the wilderness by God in a cloud. Like the cloud was ahead of them. So that really just points to God was guiding them and obviously just present. So they had the blessing of God's guidance literally in front of them in his presence. And if another thing that they had was passing through the sea. If you've been in church for a little bit of time, you've heard of the Red Sea and them crossing on dry ground. And that is just such a miracle. I know we hear it a lot. You may have heard it a lot, so it kind of can... You're like, oh yeah, they passed through dry ground. But that was an absolute miracle. That was a deliverance. God delivered them from slavery. So that was huge. Another blessing that they experienced was just having provision. God provided spiritual food and drink for them, as it tells us in verses 3 and 4. So they had all these blessings that they experienced. The blessing of this miraculous escape from slavery, God providing food and water for them, and the presence and the guidance of God right there. So they received all these blessings, but they still chose to give into temptation over and over, and they just failed to honor God. So Paul tells us in verse 6, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil. So this is a warning and a message to us today. It is so relevant today. I know if you read the Bible, I know girls that you're like, this is a long time ago. This book is really old, but it's so relevant. It's so true. And God has just provided so much here for us to just show us how to live. So this is a warning for us and just an example for us. So God blessed them and was with them daily. They were not content. The Israelites were not content with what God had blessed them with. So over the next few verses, we're going to see that the things that they were tempted by. So they were tempted, but they gave into this temptation and they just committed sin. So we see in verse 7 that they gave into the temptation of worshiping idols. And specifically, it's talking about when they built the golden calf in Exodus chapter 32. And it's crazy because I thought about this. I was like, that is really strange. You know, we don't walk around like building golden calves to worship, but we do worship some things. We do very similar things. So it was crazy because I thought, well, where did they, they got the gold. It tells us that they took the gold off of their earrings and all that. But I thought about that was the actual gift that God told them that they would have through Moses in Exodus 3, that the Egyptians will give you gold. So it's just crazy that the very gift that they were given, they used to worship instead of God. So we really need to think about that as a warning because we totally can do the same thing. We sometimes fall victim to worshiping money or things on our social media, influencers on social media, or popularity, all these things. So we fall into very similar temptations. They may look different, but we still fall into temptations. Another one in verse 8 tells us that they had to struggle with sexual immorality. And so many people struggle with that today. And it tells us because of their commitment to sexual immorality, 23,000 of them died in one day, which is crazy. Verse 9 tells us, do not test the Lord, because they spoke against him. In Numbers 21, they spoke against God. And in verse 10, it tells us, don't grumble, as some of them did. And they were killed by the destroying angel. And I'll be honest, I was like, whoa, those are pretty relevant for us. Those are very relevant for us, and especially complaining and grumbling. How relevant is this story for what we're going through right now, y'all? There's so much, like worshiping idols. We do that with our phones and popularity on these things. Sexual immorality. I know we don't like to talk about it, but let's be honest, there are temptations there. And the next two are just so often overlooked. Grumbling and complaining. And we're so tempted to do that, especially with what's going on with COVID. Like, we're tempted, and we honestly do it a lot, complaining about maybe the policies around it, or maybe you complain about the decisions that your school have made about it, or your sports team have made, or even the decisions that your parents have made. How are we responding to that? I really had to think about that too. And as Paul said, this story was shared as a warning to us. So I think it's so timely for us to look at this chapter. And the enemy wants us to be consumed with these temptations. He wants us to be distracted. He wants us to take our eyes off God. Because when we focus on God completely, it is so much easier for us to handle temptation. And I just say that is really a tactic of the enemy. He wants us to give into those temptations. And you may be feeling like, I really don't struggle with those things. Well, the Bible is so relevant, because verse 12 is just for, anyone who may be feeling that way. Verse 12 says, so if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. So I think it's very interesting that we are all typically tempted to think we're doing better than we actually are. It's like, no, I don't struggle with temptation. Well, we are so tempted to think that we're doing better than we are. So the truth is, we all are going to struggle with temptation, but verse 13 also tells us what to do with that when that happens. It tells us that there's no temptation that has overtaken you that is not common to man, meaning you are not alone. Other people have experienced the same thing. Other people are experiencing similar temptations. And I encourage you, if you're dealing with temptation, certain different areas that may not even have been mentioned, tell someone, find accountability. There's just so much that temptation grows when it's in the dark and not, having other people know about that. So I just say that you are not alone, and just tell someone. Also, it tells us that God is faithful. God is so faithful. He wants to see you succeed in this area. There is no one in the world that wants to see you succeed more than God. He wants to see you win this fight over temptation. So he also tells you, you will not be tempted beyond what you can handle. Verse 13 tells us that you will not be tempted beyond what you can handle, and he will provide a way out so that you can endure it. What's so interesting, it does not say if you are tempted, it does say when you are tempted. We're all going to have temptations, but it's just, what do we do with it when we are tempted? And God tells us that he will provide a way out. But we do have to choose it. We do have to choose it. There are so many times that we pray for God to take the temptation away. We want it removed, like, oh my gosh, Lord, please help me not struggle with this. But he's saying, I will provide a way out so that you can endure it. He provides a way out, but the ball is still in our court to choose it. One thing is for sure, we will all be tempted, but we can rest knowing that God provides a way out. When I'm tempted to complain, I can choose whether or not to fall into that, to continue in that. So he provides a way out, but the ball is in our court to do that. So let's recap these 13 verses. The blessings the Israelites enjoyed. They enjoyed all of these blessings like we do as well. They had temptations they fell into, and we also struggle with temptations. But a word for you, just remember how God gives us a way out and a way for us to handle the temptations. And it's just so relevant for us today. And I know we're only able to cover a few verses in this chapter today, so I invite you to read the whole chapter and discuss it with each other. I am so glad I had a moment to spend going over these verses with you guys. I'm just so excited for what you're going to discuss in your groups.